So you've heard it now in person, William. That is the Alexandra clap, and that marks the start of the Skadi Podcast.
Starter's whistle.
It is the start. Yeah, it's start whistle, starter's clap. It's also a little bit different here because we're doing this in front of the cameras. Of course, if you're listening at home on the podcast, you won't be seeing this. But there is an opportunity, we think, to see the Skadi Podcast in video.
Yes.
So we've got a whole crew here. We've welcomed Luna in here today, as well as Alexandra. So Alexandra's sitting there looking after the sound.
Live studio audience.
I know, it's true. So we've got to be on our best behaviour. William Taaffe, Lockdown Cybersecurity, welcome.
Applause. Thank you very much for having me, Nick.
Yeah, no, and what a week to have you as well. This wasn't really planned, but of course we've had the CrownStrike situation in the last week before coming together. So really gives us a good forum, I guess, to sort of have a discussion. But really why I wanted to get you on here, obviously you help us with our cyber portfolio at Skadi. And I really wanted to get a kind of overview for the listeners and for me, to be honest, about cybercrime generally. And just some of the things that you know, from your perspective, that you can sort of take us on a little journey through what the world is like. So, I mean, why don't we start with that? And actually, you know, I am real non-practitioner. I'm 51 years old. Of course, I've been working with technology all my career. 30 years in finance in August. Yeah. We're nearly there, which is kind of shocking to me. But there we go. Can you just talk us through maybe a bit of the evolution of cybercrime and how that sort of looked up to where we are now, you know, the 2024 picture.
Do you like movies, Nick?
I love them. I absolutely love them.
Do you remember watching cyber movies when you were younger?
What, like War Games?
War Games?
That's my favourite. I mean, that's yeah. And when you've watched a film like that, you never want to watch any other.
So the interesting thing with War Games was a couple of years ago there was a news story, and it was of a kid who had hacked the school, who had pretty much done exactly what had happened in War Games, but in real life. And it was just one of those cases of life imitating art, and art imitating life again. And the film for me was Hackers in 1995. I was almost like slightly too young for War Games, right? But so my seminal film was Hackers with Angelina Jolie. Do you remember that one?
No.
Don't remember Hackers?
And don't think so.
So Hackers was 1995, and if you watch it today, it's a strange watch because when they're performing their hacking actions, the consequence of the actions that they're taking are blowing machines up. You can see servers lighting on fire.
Explosions and things, right.
And it's a very dramatized kind of version of what could happen. But interestingly, in the 90s, there was a lot of concepts that if you could overload some kind of electrical system, that you could cause that effect to happen. You could cause something to melt down and to break and to explode.
Right.
So it's not completely rooted in fiction, but it is taking a creative license with what you're seeing there.
Yeah.
But the tagline for that movie was phenomenal, right? If you take a look, type it into the internet, Hackers 1995. The tagline for the movie on the poster says, "Their only crime was curiosity." Right? And we're 30 years later, and now their crime's extortion. So you can see the shift in how things have moved forward since then.
Well, it is interesting because as a kid, and my mum was very forward thinking. She got us, I think, a BBC Micro computer very early on. And my friend down the road was Wyatt, who was American. And he was already a hacker.
Right.
But he had, we had no concept. So we had this computer, but certainly had no internet access. Mm-hmm. You know, he had something called a modem, which we were like, wow, what's that? Seriously. I mean, that's what it was like. But he was really into, he was just so far ahead of anywhere I was going to be and probably would ever go.
Sure.
So it's kind of interesting that the crime of curiosity, he was definitely, curious about stuff and trying to do things, trying to sort of exercise, that I guess, test the bounds of where he could go in this kind of new playing field, right?
Do you know the term hacking? Like if you look at the etymology of the term, I think that's the right term, etymology, where the word comes from, originates from. It's nobody has a definitive answer on this, right? But they reckon that you took one piece of software or a system and you took another piece of software and a system and you hacked them together, literally in a literal sense, putting them together to see if you could perform a different function once you applied them together. And that's where the concept hacking comes from. And so I think when you look back at the history of it, and it ranges back from 1903. So actually, it was Marconi's Morse code machine. That was the very first instance of a hack. It was Marconi demonstrating this to the Times newspaper and the Daily Telegraph and all of the other broadsheets. And during the exhibition to demonstrate the hardware and the technology, two people had broken into the room, and they were university students, and they managed to pipe a different Morse code message with expletives on it.
Right.
And somebody stood up and read the message, which was obviously a compromised message that they'd manipulated, and everybody in the studio hall laughed. And that's what hacking was. Hacking was something that you just did to be a bit mischievous, and you just did to see what was possible. And a really good point in case with this is actually, did you ever come across the Morris worm before? It's not a dance, Nick. It's a tool. Do you ever come across this term, the Morris worm?
No.
So Robert Morris was a young man in his 20s in the 1980s, and his dad was one of the chief technical officers at the NSA.
Right.
And Robert Morris created this internet worm, which ended up being hugely problematic. It infected something like 10% of the entire internet in the 80s. And it was mostly military personnel and military operations that were using it at that point that it caused problems to. And so this was something, when he was later asked why he did it, he said, I just wanted to see what would happen. I wasn't sure what was happening, if it could work. And I just wanted to see if it could work. And that experiment, that was just an experiment in his mind, was estimated to cost £10 million worth of damage. And that was back in the 90s. So actually, back then, hacking was seen as mischievous. It was seen as something that wasn't really monetized. There was no criminal element to it, and at least there was no organized criminal element to it. But what you did see was that all those early attacks and early instances did cause damage in terms of financial damage to systems which were brought down by it, for functions which couldn't be completed, restoration work which would sometimes take weeks. So we could see the blueprint for disturbance and an operational disturbance even back then. But really what happened was, I mean, when did you first kind of get your email going and in earnest start using it? Can you remember what year that was?
So I remember that very vividly. So when I started in 1994, we had CC Mail, which was sort of company mail, and I don't think everybody had it.
Yeah.
You had to apply for it, and I got it because I worked in a research area, right. And I would need to email through Bearing's, international network of analysts, because we were a research house with, feet on the ground in a lot of markets, in emerging markets, places like Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Japan, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, all these different places. So I had CC Mail, and then that gave way to email afterwards. And I think the difference being that CC Mail, I think I was only inside the company.
Right. Okay.
And I seem to remember, because we were the Bearings Index Research Group, the BEMI, Bearing Emerging Markets Index Group. We were producing benchmarks for people, and we would email out to them. Or maybe we sent them files. Actually, we probably sent. I don't think we emailed. I think we used a file transfer protocol as opposed to an email. But I think later we then moved to email, where you could email externally. But when I first started, I think the point about CC Mail was it was only internal in the company, and it wasn't long, maybe a couple of years before we were going external. So that's my recollection.
This is quite an interesting one, because it was the infancy of email, really, right? I mean, it wasn't in terms of how long it had been available, but it was in terms of the mass proliferation.
Absolutely.
Of it. So back in those days, obviously, you had mobile phones. Probably just about, or touching on mobiles.
It was bigger than that. It's one of those. I mean, it was they were massive. These great big Nokia things and Motorola things.
I remember them. Full handsets and pagers. I actually missed.
I had a pager.
I liked a pager. But here's the thing, right? With internet, it was a competitive environment for email. How many do you remember receiving? Was it as popular, say, as what it is today, when you compare what your email looks like today with how much you use it, and for all the different types of functions? We're using it in the same way.
I think it's difficult to say, because I think what happened to me was I moved quite quickly up the once I got into trading, and I was very confident. Obviously, Damien isn't here, so he can't contradict anything, which is great. He's sitting on holiday in the Channel Islands.
Hope you're having a nice time, Damien.
Yeah, shout out to Damien. But it meant that I got very quickly onto the kind of within a matter of years onto the kind of management information cycle, and also what tends to happen in finance, William, is that people want to, one, make sure everyone is informed, but two, also cover themselves.
Yes.
And so I found myself very rapidly copied onto all manner of email chains that I may or may not have had any interest in or be relevant to me. What I do remember is the first time I had a really kind of close employee reporting to me. It was a guy called James. And it was the first time I saw spam email.
Well, that's where I was
that's
heading.
the kind of,
so that was a good segue.
So yes, I segued right into it because I was upset by it. I was upset that my employee was receiving these emails about genitalia and all kinds of stuff. And it was, one, how dare they? But two, how is it that our internal systems is not just stopping this stuff coming through?
Yeah, good point.
Why is this stuff even being allowed to get through to our staff?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be getting that far. We should have the systems in place to stop it. But I wasn't an IT person. And so my kind of conversation with whoever I was kind of talking to didn't go very far, I don't think. So, they didn't see things quite the way I saw it.
So there was an interesting one here, right? That was 1999, and it was called the Melissa Worm. And the Melissa Worm could be the thing that you're actually talking about.
Okay.
Because what it did was it sent a Word file with compromised porn websites and with usernames and passwords and credentials that you could use to access those. But what it did, because of the nature of a worm moving from one email to another, it would infect your system, and it would use your Outlook contact book, and it would send that email to 50 of your contacts, and as soon as they opened it, it would send them to 50 of their contacts, and so on and so forth. So incrementally, it would start spreading throughout the internet and cause problems to numbers of different mailboxes. And the person who launched that actually ended up serving 20 months in jail. So we often don't see criminality when criminals, we don't see it punished that often in cyber, really, do we? Like you don't see people put in the newspapers, cyber criminal gets 25 years, gets 30 years. Actually, it's very difficult to kind of enforce that. So that story was in the 90s, and you can actually see maybe it's become easier to hide your presence, right? But in the end of the 90s, that Melissa worm was actually used to spread pornography. And one of the things that they used to do with spam was you'd get sent it and you'd think, well, who's clicking on this and buying things? Nobody's going to be doing that, right? But in actual fact, if you had a big enough base to do it from, people would click on them and they would spend money. And that was a really seminal point, actually, in this story. Because even though it might seem inconsequential, what does the Melissa worm that propagated and spread, what does that have to do with what we're seeing with ransomware? But what it did was it showed that you could actually earn money from using a type of cyber attack, right? Because this was an automated cyber attack. It was a worm. It spread without human involvement. But the consequence was that people would click on those adverts, they would spend money, and then there would be an affiliate link that they would get money through. So it started to get to people thinking about, actually, have we got this wrong, right? For a long time, hacking was mischievous. And then in the 90s, for some weird reason, it went malicious, right? Think about the terminology, even virus. Do you hear virus anymore, really, when people speak about computers?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I very rarely hear that phrase. But I think, putting a date on it, I can absolutely think that we were still talking about viruses back in when I was in Hong Kong, which is 2004, 2008. That helps me kind of put a time frame on it. So we're getting on for 20 years ago, but like the language of 15, 20 years ago was virus was still a prevalent term, right?
And we still know it because we talk about antivirus.
Yes.
And in today's society, you've got EDRs and MDRs and XDRs and WTFs, because what does any of these things mean, right? Because the meaning kind of moves away from them. But the legacy of that word in virus is that, McAfee's antivirus, Norton antivirus, the big companies that emerged from the 90s, especially in the consumer market. But a virus was a seek and destroy tool. it had no real value to it in terms of the ability to make money on the back of it, except maybe as an extortion card that you would launch a cruise missile at somebody and destroy all of their data. And what's quite interesting, and we'll come back to this at the end, is how life goes full circle. And those types of tools, those type of malicious tools, are also seeing a comeback, but in a very different way, and I'll touch on that later. But then what we really started to see was that probably, well, here's one for you, Nick. When was ransomware? When do you reckon ransomware was first created?
I couldn't honestly say to you, but I mean, I would have thought it only becomes really, a problematic threat and therefore viable when people are kind of really getting that, mails into their firms and opening them stuff. So I would say mid-90s.
Mid-90s was a bold guess and a good one. It's actually 1989.
Right.
Nobody can believe that. And who created ransomware? Because nobody knows the person's name, which is a mystery to me why. Such a seminal figure in cyber crime or security is Dr. Joseph Popp, evolutionary biologist from Harvard University. Crazy story, right? And the mechanism, how do you reckon you paid? If you pay by cryptocurrency today, what do you reckon you paid in the late 80s?
Well, it can only be dollars. I can't see what else it would be.
They asked you to post a check. A check to Panama. Shout out to Lockdown CEO Karen Morrill. She has a great saying, Nick. She said this once in training. She said, "I was always told that crime doesn't pay, but it turns out it does, and it pays in Bitcoin." And I thought that was a great saying. And really, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and going back into your world here, was the huge catalyst for why ransomware suddenly became such a big beast. Because at that point, it was very fractured, right? There was a fractured process. You could be identified through the process of payment. It wasn't really a good setup for how to extort. And then all of a sudden, this 2008 white paper comes out. It promises to put some type of decentralized currency which will prevent an instance like 2008 happening, an incident that impacted you as well, Nick, right? In the financial services market at that point. And so this was the goal of crypto. It was how can we create something where if one economy gets hit, it doesn't impact all of the rest of the global economies. And so they created that. But the consequence of cryptocurrency, I think in its biggest consequence, is to be used as a vehicle to commit crime with, right? And a vehicle for payments. And so probably 2012, we started to see the evolution of ransomware and the beginnings of ransomware.
Yeah.
And back then, really, I mean, I remember paying ransom in 2013, and I remember buying Bitcoin, and I paid something like $40 per Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And I kick myself to this day that I didn't buy 100 of them for myself.
No, that's the interesting thing, because I gave a talk to the audit area that I was working in at the time in 2012 about Bitcoin, and trying to introduce it to them, but also the concept that they needed to get ahead of this, because it was only a matter of time before the front office would start using this as a vehicle for other things. My concept around cybercrime and payments, it was just never there. The way I was looking at it as a front office guy was, how would I, as a front office guy, use this to make more money for the bank, more money for myself?
Sure.
And I never realized this. And of course, looking back now, absolutely what you say. I mean, the fact that you have, it's like kidnapping. If you kidnap someone, the hardest thing is collecting the ransom, because you've got to kind of work out some kind of convoluted way of not getting snatched when you're trying to pick up the ransom. Yeah. And as you say, posting checks to Panama, there's all kinds of ways that can go wrong. It just sounds laughable, doesn't it? But isn't that wonderful? But yes, cryptocurrency really does help you, doesn't it, in that respect?
It does. Look, people say, what is the most anonymous form of payment? And it's cash. It's still cash, fundamentally, right? But cryptocurrency, I suppose the benefit of it is that where crime used to be just within your local economy, right? You would walk down the street. What was the biggest risk? That you might get mugged. You might get mugged on your street, right? And actually criminal gangs that are operating might be operating out of Cambodia, or they might be operating out of North Korea, or it might be Latvia, or it might be China, or it might be Great Britain, or it might be America, or Australia, or any country, and that's the point. It can be widespread, right? So actually the whole geographic of where an incident comes from, of where an attack can be launched is global, which is a problem because here's a really good point in case, right? I was looking at a case study for a malware botnet, which is essentially a computerized system, right? That kind of operates crime through a network, a bot network. That's what they're called, botnets. And this botnet was so big and so global that what ransomware gang operators were doing was they were piggybacking off of its infrastructure to launch attacks. And so I looked into this. Now, at the same time, the FBI had launched this massive campaign against these gangs and against cybercrime, and they'd put a lot of resource and money behind it. And what I realized was that in order to shut down this malware botnet, the FBI had to work with 17 different countries and jurisdictions as a coordinated policing effort to try to identify these rings and close them down, right? And they managed to do it, Nick. But do you know how many arrests they managed to make? This is called Operation Quackshot, for anyone who wants to read about it. Really interesting. Quackshot.
Across 17 jurisdictions.
17 jurisdictions across the globe. How many arrests do you reckon the FBI with 1,600 people at their disposal in that team? How many do you reckon they made?
I mean, as a trader, I've got to give you an answer. Can I give you a two-way?
You can.
I'll make you 22-4 on the wide.
The answer is 0.
All right.
They made 0 arrests, right? Which
I called it low.
You called it,
but not low enough.
You called it low, but not low enough, which is a bit stark, really, right? And we can dip into why some of those reasons might be. But this is the kicker, right? When I looked at the botnet, I'd always had this concept that if I had a ransomware gang and you had a ransomware gang, even if we were in different parts of the world, we'd be competitors. Because in business, when two companies are in the same sector, what are they if they're not competitive? Might be friendly competitors, but they're competitive nonetheless. What I realized when I looked at this case study is that these ransomware gangs that were piggybacking off the back of the infrastructure are all well coordinated with each other. They communicate really effectively. They share lessons learned, right? They're in constant communication with each other about what's working. They're not competitors. With the policing side, when they're looking at working in those 17 jurisdictions, they are.
Yeah, there's so many barriers. And it brings on to an interesting thing, because you've pointed out some really interesting milestones, William, I think. So you think about, the proliferation opportunity through email and that adoption and, transfer of files through that kind of medium. The payment situation with Bitcoin and being, having this avenue where you can actually, make demands, collect payment and probably get away with it.
Yeah.
And now you're talking about the information sharing. And I think the direction in which you're going in is the dark web, and that as a kind of an arena for people to be able to get together, share information, conduct essentially a kind of shadow business in terms of sharing, crime techniques and also things that they've stolen.
I think this is the problem. So like in the 90s, you could access websites for free that would have hacking tools in them. They'd have things like the Anarchist Cookbook. Do you remember the Anarchist Cookbook?
Yeah, I've heard of the Anarchist Cookbook.
I downloaded and printed a copy when I was 14 years old. Thank God I never tried to build anything with it.
Are we about to get raided? No. That is an offence, though, isn't it? They always talk about that. It's like real things. Anarchist Cookbook, But here we go. We've got someone who actually...
I actually read the Anarchist Cookbook and looked at the recipes for making this and making that. And one of the best things I never did was try and do that myself, because I would have blown myself up, no doubt.
Right.
But its information has been shared. And in the early days, actually, there was a bit of a community about sharing on the internet. That they wanted to remove pricing. It was almost like quite a liberating time, right? Where you had to go to our price and you could maybe listen to a track and you had to buy it on tape or CD. And all of a sudden, Napster came out. And Napster was offering free downloads of music. And all of a sudden, there was this liberation where things historically you had to pay for were suddenly becoming available for free.
Yeah, torrents. I remember torrents as a phrase.
Kill your computer, right? LimeWire. Anyone remember killing their computer with LimeWire? So you had behavioral type changes and communication was always, but what we've seen, I mean, you talk about the dark web. So just in case anybody listening just wants a bit of clarification on that, we might use these terms of surface web. That's the internet that that you use every day, whether it's Google or ChatGPT or any of those functions. That's what you're using. Then you have the deep web. The deep web is unarchived internet pages. They exist. There is an address for them, but you can't find them on Google. There are a lot of website pages that might be medical pages for the NHS, government pages, pages that just exist, but in an unarchived fashion. But the deep web also accounts for things like messaging applications. So do you use messaging applications? You've got a smartphone in front of you. Yeah. We chat on WhatsApp, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Use some other ones. Yeah. Discord you mentioned.
Absolutely, yeah. All of that kind of stuff.
So we call that the deep web, right? It exists. If you think about it, it's data. It's being stored somewhere in some data center somewhere. So, but you can't access it via Google, right? I can't find your chat or our chats. We know that they're encrypted too. Yeah. But that's deep web, right? And so if we take that and then we look at what's the layer down from that, that is the nefarious marketplace, which is the dark web. And that's really interesting for a lot of people. There's a lot of curiosity about what it is, but essentially it's forums. It's forums where you can buy things. It's forums where you can exchange information. It's forums where you can post messages up. And criminals traditionally were using that, especially when somebody had been breached, when they'd got access to X number of credit cards from some company file, they would end up inevitably being put onto that dark web. What you're seeing in 2024 is a shift away from that as just being the sole mechanism. By the way, the size of the deep and the dark web is considered to be between 400 to 500 times bigger than the surface internet, which is phenomenal to get your head around.
That is conceptually really tough for me. I've got my stabilizers on. I've never left the surface web in my life, Really, wow.
So it's huge. Yeah. And so actually, one of my points with that is, this is a service. I'm going to plug something that we do. Why not, right? Yeah. We do intelligence services, and we work with fraud teams. We work with investigation teams. And if you're not looking at the deep and the dark web, then you're looking at a picture that is considerably smaller than what you believe the true picture to be. So for anybody that is curious with that, hit Nick up or myself, and we can give you a bit of an explanation and a bit more insight into what that looks like. But essentially, what we've started to see is the machinations of crime and things being sold and traded, moving away from that dark web and onto platforms like Telegram.
Right, right.
Yeah, Telegram's quite a big one. Signal too. Do you know why Telegram and Signal rather than WhatsApp?
Why would it be rather than WhatsApp? That's a great question.
Put him on the spot.
I'm trying to think why that is. Is it because WhatsApp is in what I would call conventional ownership?
Oh,
whereas
could Meta
yeah, but I think it's kind of conventional. Whereas Telegram and others, I don't think are. Maybe.
Do you know what the actual reason is? Just anonymity. You don't have to register your phone number.
Okay,
that's it.
Right.
You can use a tag, a username. So, when people are part of open source intelligent operations, they're looking at tags that are used, and then they're trying to follow that tag to other forums, to other places. Really good segue into a case study here. Silk Road. Do you know anything about Silk Road?
I'm so glad you talked about that. I was going to ask you about it.
Yeah, that's an incredible story, Silk Road.
Yeah.
So Silk Road, to anybody that hasn't listened, I would thoroughly recommend, if you type in Silk Road documentary, I think it's the BBC actually, put out a 20-minute documentary. You can find it on YouTube. It's a brilliant watch, engaging throughout. And it tells the story of this chap who had created this marketplace which was selling literally billions of pounds worth of trade going through this website. And it really opened up everything from drugs to guns, and eventually through to hits, right? You could order Hitman.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting of how it came to shut down, though, and the identification behind it. So what happened actually was that the owner of it had done so well being anonymous for so long, but eventually power got a bit too much to his head, and he had an argument with somebody who he decided he wanted offed. So he posted an advert through his platform, and it attracted an FBI agent. Do you know what the FBI agent's code tag was?
I couldn't honestly say.
It was Mr. Frosty. So, Mr. Frosty, he has fun. He's coming after everyone.
Love it.
That's my play on. By the way, quick segue into that. I got Mr. Frosty when I was about 9 years old for Christmas. It was my main Christmas present. I've never been so disappointed in my life. Mr. Frosty was rubbish.
Oh, it's such a shame because he did look great on the
adverts. He was amazing. It was nothing. Reality versus perception and reality.
That is a great documentary that we must watch, and a shout out to Ashu and Pallavi and Bash and all the other members of the ACI Anti-Financial Crime Film Club,
right?
Because it's exactly the kind of thing that we would get together and watch, which we do, and we discuss. Situation, knowledge share through film, which is really great. So something like that sounds like an absolutely perfect one. We must get you along for that.
I would love that. I mean, how the story ended, right, was that even though he engaged with this FBI agent, they still didn't know his name. So he'd hid himself really well. And what happened was they realized, just through tracing back and continual open source intelligence, that actually very early on there was another name tag that he had used. So he'd used two name tags, but the first one he used only for a few months before he migrated to the second tag. And they searched that original tag and they found one forum online where he was asking an IT question about how to build some infrastructure. And he said, guys, if anybody can help me, I'd really appreciate some advice on this. You can find me at matthewparker@hotmail.com, something like that. I can't remember his name. And that's what gave it away. As soon as the FBI saw that, they thought, we've got the guy's name. And then they managed to find him on LinkedIn, which is how they did it. And then they managed to work back until his eventual arrest. So using those tags, right, is actually how people will find and how they'll look for searches for you. And there's lots of good open source intelligence tools. But what we're seeing today is this move away onto Telegram, specifically around chatter, around machinations of fraud or machinations of crime. So actually, if you're trying to think about how can we be forward thinking, right? What can we do to understand if we're being targeted? What can we do to really get on top of this situation? Then intelligence is something not enough organizations invest into. And if it provides you that early warning alarm, whether it's a week or a month before an incident happens, will that shore you up? Will that better prepare you for what's to come and potentially stop a really reputationally damaging or financially damaging attack? I think it will. It's out to the audience. I'd love to hear experiences. If anyone's got experiences of using intelligence to try to halt a cybercrime or how it has helped, please do reach out. I'd love to hear it.
Great. Well, that's a fantastic gallop through to where we are now. Can we talk a little bit about cyber regulation, globally? And also, I guess locally, and just, what is there a consistency of approach? Are there any particular differences that you can flag up?
So I think when you look at regulations and the regulated environment, and I can only talk from my perspective in my role, because that's the regulations I know more. But even from a policing perspective, until recently, we're still prosecuting people with the Computer Misuse Act 1990. Completely antiquated, built from a different time. GDPR we know about because 2016 came, fully in at 2018. It's a reasonably new thing, and people talk about GDPR. But what predated that was the Data Protection Act 1998, which ran until 2016. And 1998 was the year that Google launched. So the landscape, again, when we write regulations, we're almost writing them for 30 years.
Right.
But the technology environment is so accelerated that they're antiquated in a very, very short space of time. And so one of the challenges that regulators have had is they say, okay, Nick, we recognize that cybercrime is a problem. And just to illuminate this, right, there was a report that came out last week that said that if you took every predicted extortion payment that was made last year and you put them together on a global basis, it would be equivalent to the third world largest economy underneath China and America. Which is unbelievable to think of, right? It's an $8 trillion industry in crime. That's what that looks like now. And so what regulators have done is that they've recognized that this is a huge problem. It's a growing problem. It's causing disruption, disturbance of operations, services, businesses to go under. If you look at Knights of Old, the logistics company, that was a 151-year-old company, Nick, that ceased to trade last year, went into administration following a cyber incident. Right. So in the worst case scenario, we call those extinction events. A business falling victim to a cyber attack and becoming, going out of existence as a result of that. Yeah. So what the regulators did was they said, historically, we've got a problem. We know cybercrime is a problem. So we're going to tell William what he needs to do is he has to have business-grade antivirus protection on his devices. But the issue with that is that by the time it's drafted, to the time it comes into law, to the time it's being applied, and then it's 2 years later, and what happens? Quantum technology. Yeah. For example, right? Just to shoot off. Yeah. And now, actually, what they've signposted in the regulations is no longer fit as a technology form for the environment that we're trying to contend against. So what they've done is they've looked at, say, right, let's remove specific forms of technology. And let's look at what's a constant, what will always be there. And so what we see changes in is starting to ask for requirements around, okay, let's forget about the technology here. Can you demonstrate what you would do in an incident to us? Because irrespective of the technology, you must have a plan of how you will respond to an incident. And some people call that business continuity, and sometimes it's called disaster recovery, and sometimes it's built into incident response. Yeah. And there are slight differences between all three, but essentially they're pretty much the same challenge. Yeah. If something were to happen to us today, if something was to impact the business, if the electricity was to turn off, can we function, and for how long? And that's a really interesting question. And I think originally what the regulators were doing was they were trying to pose that as a question to businesses to demonstrate. And now what they're saying is, yes, that is really, really important. But actually, if you're a supplier to a very large group, and if an incident impacts you, would then impact the larger group and its operations, are you making sure that you're holding to the same standard through your supply chain of those large groups? And so when we look at regulation, and I think I'm going to look outside of the UK for this. I'm going to look to DORA, Financial Services. That's the Digital Operational Resilience Act. It's coming into law next year. It's going to affect all of the large banks, the clients that you work with on a daily basis. It's also going to affect insurance companies and other professional services firms along that supply chain. The other one that's quite impactful is NIS2. NIS2, sometimes it's referred to. Another European Union directive, building on the principles of the very first NIS principles, but basically saying for critical services. Now that could be logistics because it depends on how a country can be serviced. It could be manufacturing in food or drink. It could be gas, energy, could be healthcare, right? So it's those critical services that may not necessarily be a government-run service. It might be a private sector solution, but those critical services, and what they're essentially saying to those people is that you have to have understood your cyber posture. You have to be able to report on it. You have to be able to look at threat intelligence and how you're sharing that threat intelligence with your supply chain partners as well. But the key bit for me is the supply chain review. Yeah. And that, I think, is something that's really challenging for a lot of companies. And we sit here, I mean, we've just come out of CrownStrike, right? Yeah. CrownStrike wasn't a cyber incident, was it?
No, this is, I wanted to ask you about this. Let's talk about CrownStrike. Great. So obviously it wasn't a cyber incident, right? It's just something that's gone wrong, right?
Yeah, so CrownStrike's a really good company, right? They're really bona fide, good company. And you know how people realized they were a really good company because people saw how many businesses were impacted when they had the incident.
That's true.
And then everyone said, God, they've got a lot of clients. Right? So you know that they're doing well because of that. And actually, have they made a mistake? Absolutely, right? But mistakes happen. It's human error. Right, and so somebody has made an uncontrolled change in a live environment, which is a no-no, right? But it's a human error mistake. But the consequence of that is very much similar in parallel to a cyber incident, isn't it? And this is often what I say. So we think of cyber incidents and the reputational damage of things being exposed in the wild and confidential information being out there in the wild, right? That's what we're concerned about. Breaching regulations, industry fines, losing customers as a result of reputational damage, of losing their personal data. But actually, for large banking organizations even, we've got numbers of stories of where people have misconfigured buckets in the cloud, right? Slight misconfigurations just done by human error of not pressing one thing or not typing one line of code in that's exposed the same level of data in the wild. So actually the consequences of a misconfiguration are as damaging as the consequences of a cyber attack. It leads to a data breach. The consequences of CrownStrike didn't lead to a data breach, but it led to what we call unavailability.
Yeah.
So one of the pillars of cybersecurity is availability, confidentiality, and integrity of data. And we often think of confidentiality because that's what the regulations are really on top of. And we think of availability because things like DORA, Digital Operational Resilience Act, is looking at availability, maintaining a service to your customer. If you can't take a payment, if I can't draw cash out from a bank machine, that's a problem. Yeah. How do we make sure that we maintain availability of service? So this is really what it's being signposted about. And I think when we look at CrownStrike and a supply chain incident, what we see is an error being made that impacted so many businesses in not being able to maintain availability of service and the knock-on consequences that does and the litigious consequences of it, as well as reputational. So actually, we're starting to see this world where we've become linked. Everything is connected. We're trying to integrate everything. We're trying to use data, right? We've got this concept that data is the new gold. Somebody said to me once, they said, everybody is obsessed with big data until they start a big data project and realize it's like a fire hose that's out of control.
Great. Yeah. Great analogy.
And that's what it is. So we want to consume data. We see the value in it, in making decisions, right? But actually, this is quite a nice point for cyber because we're entering into a new environment where, take yourself, for example. You use ChatGPT. Do you use AI tools? Are you using automation much, Nick?
Well, as I posted in the week, I found out that with Zoom, it'll now pose questions for me in my meetings, which I just, as an investigator, I find quite embarrassing, actually, that I could be conducting some kind of investigation interview and Zoom could be prompting me because I haven't asked, did you do it? or other such questions.
Yeah, it'd be great for salespeople, wouldn't it? Just to make sure they've asked all the right questions.
Please don't get a trader started on salespeople. Gosh, this could be a dreadful podcast.
So the thing is with AI tools is that they're brilliant, right? And they're a massive efficiency gain if they're used right. Yeah. But the problem is we're going to become overly reliant on them, aren't we? It's destined to happen. You can see it happening. We'll get less creative. We'll become more reliant on it. The better it gets, the more powerful, the quicker it can do it, the more we'll rely on that technology. That technology relies on machine-to-machine communication. It's only as good as the data which it's pulling itself off. It's not that intelligent that it can have thinking. It can think for itself and go, actually, could this be misinformation? It can't tell that, right? So we can try to build layers to stop that, but we're not there yet. So the problem is that from a cyber view of the future, if you could get in and you could disrupt data, and I'm not talking about deleting it, I'm just talking about changing the values. If you could change the numbers, now the machine to machine, when it's pulling its information, is going to be pulling wrong data, isn't it? It's going to be giving wrong answers to the questions. Yeah. And so actually, this is the integrity part of cybersecurity that nobody's looked at. And where it's important with this is actually looking, okay, we're looking at ransomware gangs, right? And we're looking at extortion and the rise of that. And then we're looking at crime as a service, call it crime as a service, ransomware as a service, the rise of criminal organized gangs and their sophistication. But what about thinking about a cyber incident as part of warfare? What about looking actually, how else could this impact our society? And we start to look at things like what's happening in Ukraine. Shout out to the Ukrainian cafe around the corner. They did excellent lunch for us, by the way. But we can see things like sandworm. Have you heard of sandworm?
No.
The sandworm was thought to be a Russian tool that was created to destroy critical national infrastructure in Ukraine.
Right.
We've also seen instances of critical national infrastructure being targeted in Costa Rica. Actually took them.
Why Costa Rica?
Do you know what? I don't know. I don't know why Costa Rica, but I know the consequence that cyber attack on their national infrastructure brought down hospitals and public services for up to 8 weeks, including their ability to collect taxes.
Wow.
Yeah. So massive consequence, right? So actually, when we start to think about how war might look in the future and what the very first stages of that process might look like, or how to disrupt an economy as the start point for launching a different attack, right? To get misinformation, to get people. This is actually where it's going to happen, I think.
Yeah.
We're going to start to see attacks on infrastructure that are looking to destroy the way that machines communicate with other machines because of its knock-on impact.
Yeah.
And I think that's the scariest thing about what we do is that, yes, at the moment we can see it's money, right? And we understand that motivation and it's quite easy to see through. But when money stops becoming the motivation and when technology continues to advance and when the techniques that are used continue to evolve in sophistication, that's when I think we're into a really scary place.
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right, because the playing field is changing, because you have these kind of, I wouldn't want to call them private enterprises, but that's what hacking groups essentially are, right? But you have a kind of swing or a rise in the impact now of kind of state-sponsored sets. You've got, the North Korean cyber commandos. You see a lot of Russian attacks, Iranian attacks increasingly becoming prominent as well.
Yeah.
And Chinese, right, as well.
Absolutely.
And I have no doubt, we're not, point fingers at all these things. We must be doing the same kind of stuff ourselves.
Be naive to think we're not.
Exactly. And as you say, the sort of the change in that kind of motivation becomes very different at a state level.
It does.
Than the kind of private level of just going after cash, right?
It does. But I mean, I think when you saw sanctions in Russia, what's a good way of getting back? Well, let's take payments. Let's disrupt economies of other countries through launching cyber attacks. What was really interesting to me was that coordinated efforts to shut down some of these biggest coordinated operators, right? So I'm going to use 2 examples for you. You probably heard of these gangs before. One is called the Conti gang. Come across Conti?
Yeah.
The other one is Lockbit. You heard Lockbit?
No, I don't know Lockbit.
Right, so Lockbit's actually even bigger.
Right.
And the way that Lockbit built itself up was this affiliate model, ransomware as a service. You can be an affiliate member of Lockbit, and you can use their technology, and you'll give them a commission for using their technology, to using their infrastructure. And these technologies are really, really advanced, but I'm going to focus on Conti Group, right? So Conti, well known through a number of really large breaches and attacks, sophisticated and targeted attacks. Really interestingly, there were 2 things that Conti did which just mystified me when I read. One was that they had a PR campaign. Can you believe that? And it wasn't like a PR campaign of how they'd communicate on the dark web. It was a PR campaign of how they would communicate to mainstream media.
Right.
And do you know why they wanted a PR campaign for mainstream media?
I really can't imagine.
They wanted the mainstream media to be able to communicate that if you were impacted by the Conti ransomware gang and you paid the ransom, that they would hold their end of the bargain. That was it. They just wanted people to know that if you paid the ransom, you'd get your data back, and they were legitimate in that. So that was a coordinated PR campaign that they did. The other thing that they had was a call center.
Yeah.
I've got a recording of it. It's unbelievable. They've got an actual call center. It mimics, right? So when we think of these think of them like a legitimate business, right? It's going to be in a building that's got a big floor in it, that's got a call center in it, that's got technology in it, that has probably employee contracts, if you can believe it, right? This whole thing is not amateur at all. It is hugely sophisticated. And when the FBI really went about closing them down and they shut them down, do you know what it mirrored to me in my head? It mirrored the Iraq War when we went and removed Saddam.
How so? Explain that, because that's kind of like one person. Were you talking about cutting off the head of the snake? Is that what happened with the Conti group?
Yeah. So I guess from a law enforcement perspective, they thought, look, we might not be able to identify all of these players, and because they might be based in Russia or countries with non-extradition clauses, we might not be able to extradite, but we can destroy their infrastructure, and we can go after them, and we can try to take back money and I can't think of the word for it, but take the money back, seize the money, seizures, right? Financial seizures and identification of mule networks and everything else of how they're laundering the money. The consequence of shutting down Conti was the emergence of black hat, black cat, black suit, black everything, black basta, and a number of other ransomware groups that emerged from the shadows. So it poses the question, actually, that by destroying one group, are we actually creating 10 splinter cells out of that one destruction of the core group? Are we creating a bigger problem for us? And then the other thing that I just thought is a real interesting ethical dilemma was actually, did you say anything about CDK, the automotive software provider in America, in the news?
Is this a ransom situation?
It was a ransom situation. It's about 3 weeks old now. Did you see this?
I didn't see, but go on, tell me.
So their software is a prominent player in most dealership sites in the US. They are the market leader for software of ERP type software. It's called a DMS, a dealer management system.
And ERP is what?
An ERP is an enterprise resource planner. It's a bit like a CRM, but it has more functions across the business in terms of managing stock and managing every aspect of the business.
Okay.
So organizations will use these tools to manage themselves. And the DMS manages a dealership group. It manages what stock levels they've got. It manages their customer database. Might manage social media things. It might manage finance functions as well. So it does a variety of different things. CDK were impacted and they were hit with ransomware in America. As a result of CDK being hit by ransomware, over 15,000 motor dealers in the US suddenly couldn't use any of their software in their buildings.
Right.
Now, CDK were hit with a ransom demand of $25 million. They chose not to pay it. 12 days later, after these dealer groups were still down and hadn't been able to trade for 12 days, CDK paid the $25 million. The question is there, from a financial decision, if you were trying to build out risk planning and scenario risk planning and continuity, would it have been better to have paid the ransom when they first received the response and limit the eventual financial damage that would have occurred? Or actually, because their ethical stance was not to pay the criminals, should that be commended, even though it might have led to $1 billion worth of damage in retrospectively?
Yeah. That's very, very difficult, but I think I would definitely be coming out very hard on the side of don't pay.
Yeah.
Don't pay. But it is a difficult one. It's a very, very difficult one.
It is. And it's an ethical dilemma. And I think this is where the regulators are looking. So they're saying, in answer to your question before, what commonality? Supply chain, intelligence, understanding your estate, providing training. Still, organizations have a very naive way of training, really, a limited way of delivering training, of recording it, of really understanding how it's driving value in an organization. Sometimes it's too much of a tick box and it's not actually looked at business improvement and business performance. But one of the things that the regulators are starting to align with is responsibility at board level, and that you can't, no longer can you shirk this responsibility. That if you're a board and you're a business of any size that's of any consequence and you're providing services to the public, you have to be able, or to other businesses, you have to be able to be responsible at that board level, that you're making decisions based on these things that are satisfying regulations, and that ultimately the buck will stop at you.
Well, William, I really want to thank you for that gallop through cyber. I feel like we could have done probably, and maybe we can do, many more episodes, and we certainly should in the future.
Fun.
I think that was absolutely great. You mentioned the training aspect.
Yeah.
I'm going to get you into the Discord.
Okay.
That is Skadi's chat community, where you can be a friend of the show. You're definitely a friend of the show. And Alexandra will also have for you an I've Survived the Skadi Podcast mug.
Hey!
Which is very coveted. And you can, next time you come, and you can have your Americano in the Skadi Podcast mug.
I look forward to that.
But the other thing too is that we're very proud of the quality of the information on the Skadi Podcast. If you do join the Discord, you will find in the forum related to William's podcast, the Cyber Podcast, you will find a certificate for CPD that you can show to your your training manager and see if you can claim credits against listening to this podcast, because I think you've had an hour of education from William and myself, which I very much enjoyed, and hopefully William will be around as well if people join, maybe to answer some questions in the Discord too, or any of the Skadi team, and of course all of the information from all of our other podcasts is in there too, so it's a real treasure trove. But anyway, thank you so much, William, for coming in and talking to us about cyber. It's been very, very enjoyable, and we'll be back soon, no doubt, with a Horizon Unpacked episode towards the end of the month. But until then, thank you very much for coming in, and thank you to all our listeners.
Thank you so much. Cheers, Nick.